Hi, I'm here with Daniel Placido, author of Perennial Philosophy and Renaissance. First and foremost, Daniel, what is perennial philosophy? In my article, I argue that perennial philosophy, from a historical perspective, without adhering to any kind of essentialism or anything like that, is a structure that recurs throughout Western esoteric and philosophical tradition. What are its features, in my opinion? Firstly, the idea of a unity between philosophy and theology. Number two, it seeks to find common ground or a dialogue between Western and Eastern traditions within a flexible frame of references. And thirdly, the idea that there is a lineage or several lineages that express this unity between philosophy and theology and this common ground between Western and Eastern traditions. If we look at it from this historical perspective, there are three moments. I deal with the first two moments surely in my article to discuss perennial philosophy. The first moment being in ancient history, especially in its late period, when we encounter authors such as Plato, Philo of Alexandria, Proclus, and church fathers such as Lactantius and St. Augustine. They contributed towards the idea of a perennial philosophy. They were already talking about a dialogue between traditions. They had to acknowledge the heritage of Hellenic philosophy in its dialogue with Christianity, for example, in the case of the Church Fathers. Also, during the medieval period, we could mention some authors such as Suhrawardi and Psellos. A second moment, which is quite special for this topic, is the Renaissance period. This is the main focus of my article. At that period, there was a favorable atmosphere with cultural syncretism going on and an encounter of different traditions, and intellectuals of the time, such as Platon and Ficino or Pico della Mirandola, among others, had to deal with this cultural melting pot, this synthesis, this mix of traditions, especially in the light of Christianity, which was the hegemonic tradition there in the European environment. It was in the 19th and 20th centuries that the perennial philosophy re-emerged, this time with an Orientalist veneer. This topic in particular I do not address in this article. I do talk about it in the other article, which focuses on anthroposophy, but does address it a little bit. Daniel, it's interesting that you say that this cultural flourishing took place mainly during the Renaissance period. Why did it all take place precisely during this period? Well, during the Renaissance, there was a context that made it easier for perennial philosophy to flourish due to a number of factors, historical, social, and cultural factors. For example, during that time, as I have already mentioned, there was an encounter between traditions, philosophies, and doctrines that had different origins. For example, the Hellenistic element, such as Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and theurgy, and even older traditions like Orphism, they all re-emerged during this period. And they will in turn encounter materials that have a more monotheistic origin, such as the Kabbalah and Jewish tradition. For intellectuals of this period, the intellectual challenge was finding a synthesis. And this is precisely the idea of perennial philosophy between these different strands. At the same period, however, one also encounters, for example, characters such as Lorenzo de' Medici. He is the one who goes treasure hunting for manuscripts, so that these qualified intellectuals can translate these texts, such as the Corpus Hermeticum, brought by Ficino, and these will circulate among the intelligentsia and those who took an interest in occult esoteric practices. During this period, we also encounter authors who were either immigrants or people who arrived, for example, in Italy and Florence and other places, and who were qualified to translate materials of Greek origin, for example, as is the case of the Corpus Hermeticum, or also material pertaining to the Jewish tradition, like the Kabbalah. So, all these factors combined provided the Renaissance environment with a favorable atmosphere to talk about perennial philosophy. And we can thus highlight three authors whom I talk about on my article. They offered a special contribution in this Renaissance context. The first of them is a Byzantine philosopher called Gemistos Platon. He was from Byzantium and was in Italy during the time of the Council of Union of the two churches, the Western Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. And Platon was an author who made Latin scholars raise their eyebrows, Cosimo de' Medici especially. He made them pay attention to Plato's importance. Plato, for him, was far superior to Aristotle. In addition, Plato, for him, had way more in common with Christianity than Aristotle had. Platon himself had pagan inclinations. He argued that Zoroaster's doctrine was consistent with Platonism. So, this author is really an important source to anyone who wishes to talk about perennial philosophy during that period, even though he did not employ the term himself. In any case, he talks about a lineage. Very ancient wise legislators dating back all the way to Zoroaster, and then Plato and the Platonists. A second similar author in a way is Marsilio Ficino. He was funded by Lorenzo de' Medici to, first of all, translate all Plato's works, then to translate the Corpus Hermeticum, and a series of Platonic and Neoplatonic materials, as well as Pythagorean and Orphic ones, and so on. Ficino came up in his work with an idea that closely resembles perennial philosophy, namely the idea of prisca theologia. There is this one ancient theology, and it gives a common ground to different traditions, which in turn are precursors of Christianity. This would be the doctrine of Hermes Trismegistus, for instance. It appears in the works of Orpheus, Aglaophamus, Pythagoras, all the way to Plato. After Christianity, it goes on, this ancient theology, in a superior form. Ficino worked on this idea a lot throughout his works, and he kept re-elaborating it until the end of his life. He changed his mind on the lineages, for example, influenced by Platon. At some point, he went on to place Zoroaster as being the most ancient one. Why this strategy? Because he believed Zoroastrianism had a natural connection with Christianity, because of the Magi who appear, for example, in the Gospel. Christianity for him was thus a superior and improved continuation of something older, right? And finally, we have another author, a third author. He is the one who will actually employ the term perennial philosophy proper. This author, Agostino Steuco, was a Vatican librarian, very erudite. He read the previous authors, Ficino himself, Pico della Mirandola. He read the Hermetic texts. Agostino Steuco employed this term, perennial philosophy. And he changed the idea a bit. He made it much more Christocentric, because he was a Catholic author. For example, he claimed perennial philosophy was the original primordial wisdom, which God revealed directly to Adam. This divine science was revealed to Adam, and Adam passed it on to the prophets, the patriarchs, Noah, and from the Jewish people it passed on to other peoples, other traditions. So in Agostino Steuco's view, men have, over time, introduced erroneous conceptions into perennial philosophy. Men turned too much to the material level of existence and forgot the religious part, the piety. So this perennial philosophy was getting obscured. However, as he was a Catholic author, he claimed that the coming of Jesus, the advent of Christianity, rescued the original perennial philosophy. Jesus brought back this divine wisdom, and it was once again made available to humanity. The assumption being that the Church holds this knowledge, right? So you see, those are three authors from the same period who worked on a similar concept and yet in a different way. There are many others, such as Pico della Mirandola, Giordano Bruno, and Franciscus Patricius, who talked about this perennial philosophy or ancient theology, and several other similar expressions. This topic became commonplace in this context.